It's ruined, just like everything else.
Father, he's coming! The teacher!
In the narrow streets of Jericho, where the dust of the desert mixed with the clamor of merchants and travelers, there lived a potter named Eliam. His workshop sat at the edge of the city, a humble structure of clay bricks and weathered wood, where the wheel turned ceaselessly under his skilled hands. Eliam was 40 years old, his face lined not just by the sun, but by sorrows that had carved themselves deep into his soul. His hands, though strong and steady at the wheel, bore the scars of a life that had shattered and reformed him, much like the vessels he shaped from the earth. Eliam had not always been a solitary potter. Once he had been a man of standing in Jericho, a merchant who traded in fine pottery and olive oil, his goods sought after from Jerusalem to Damascus. He had married young to a woman named Abigail, whose laughter had filled their home like music. They had 3 children, 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin, and a daughter, Naomi, whose eyes sparkled with the innocence of youth. But 6 years ago, a fever had swept through Jericho, claiming Abigail and little Naomi in the span of a week. Eliam had watched helplessly as they slipped away, their bodies burning with a heat no water could cool. The grief had unmade him. He abandoned his merchant business, unable to face the world that had stolen his beloveds, and retreated to the potter's wheel, the only place where he could shape something with his hands and feel a semblance of control. His sons, Joseph, now 18, and Benjamin, 16, had grown distant, their own grief hardening them in ways Eliam could not reach. Joseph worked the fields, his silence heavy, while Benjamin drifted toward the company of zealots, young men who spoke of rebellion against Rome with fire in their eyes. Eliam tried to hold them close, but they slipped through his fingers like water, leaving him alone with his clay and his memories. It was the spring of 30 A.D., and the air in Jericho buzzed with stories. Travelers passing through spoke of a teacher from Nazareth, a man named Jesus who walked the land performing miracles, healing the sick, giving sight to the blind, even raising the dead. They said his words cut to the heart, that he spoke of a kingdom where the broken would be made whole. Eliam listened to these tales as he worked, his hands shaping a jar on the wheel, but he felt nothing. What good were miracles to a man whose heart was a shattered vessel? What words could mend a soul ground into dust? One morning, as the sun climbed over the hills, Eliam was trimming the rim of a freshly thrown pot when Benjamin burst into the workshop, his face flushed with excitement. "Father, he's coming! The teacher! He's entering Jericho today!" Eliam barely glanced up. "Let him come. It changes nothing." Benjamin grabbed his father's arm, his grip urgent. "Father, please, just come see him. They say he can heal anything. Maybe he can help you." Eliam pulled his arm free, his voice sharp. "Help me? With what? Clay pots? Your mother and sister are dead, boy. No teacher can bring them back." Benjamin's face crumpled, and he turned away, his shoulders slumping. Eliam felt a pang of regret, but the words were out, and he returned to his wheel. Benjamin left without another word, and the workshop fell silent again, save for the creak of the wheel and the slap of wet clay. But as the hours passed, Eliam found his mind wandering. The stories of this teacher had been persistent, and even the hard shell around his heart couldn't quite block them out. What kind of man drew crowds from every town? What power did he wield to make the lame walk and the blind see? Despite himself, Eliam felt a pull, a faint stirring of something he had long since buried, curiosity or perhaps desperation. By midday, the streets of Jericho were thick with people, all pressing toward the main road where the teacher was said to pass. Eliam wiped his hands on his apron and stepped outside, telling himself he was only going to see what the fuss was about. The crowd was enormous, men and women jostling for position, children perched on their father's shoulders. Eliam stood at the back, his arms crossed, his face skeptical. Then he saw him. Jesus walked at the center of the throng, his bearing calm despite the chaos around him. He was not what Eliam expected. No regal robes, no entourage of guards, just a man in a simple tunic, his eyes warm but piercing, as if they saw through the flesh to the soul beneath. People called out to him, begging for his attention, and he stopped often, touching a hand here, speaking a word there. Eliam's throat tightened. What good were miracles to a man whose heart was a shattered vessel? What words could mend a soul ground into dust?
The crowd pressed forward, and Eliam found himself moving with it, drawn by an invisible thread. Then from the roadside, a commotion erupted. A man, Zacchaeus, the tax collector, despised by everyone in Jericho for his greed and collaboration with Rome, was perched in a sycamore tree, trying to see over the crowd. The people jeered at him, but Jesus stopped. He looked up at Zacchaeus and said, "Come down. Today I must stay at your house." The crowd gasped, Eliam among them. Why would a holy man dine with a sinner? But Zacchaeus scrambled down, his face alight with wonder, and Jesus walked with him toward his home. Eliam stood frozen, his mind reeling. This teacher chose the broken, the despised. Was there room in his kingdom for a man like Eliam, whose faith had crumbled like dry clay? That evening, Eliam sat in his workshop, staring at an unfinished jar on the wheel. His hands trembled as he picked up a tool to smooth the rim, but his grip slipped, and the jar collapsed, a shapeless lump of clay. He stared at it, his chest heaving, and then he slammed his fist on the table. "It's ruined," he muttered, "just like everything else." A voice behind him said, "Or it can be remade." Eliam spun around. Jesus stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the fading light. Eliam's heart pounded. How did you find me?" Jesus stepped inside, his gaze taking in the workshop, the shelves of finished pots, the wheel, the pile of broken shards in the corner. "I was told a potter here has skilled hands but a broken heart." Eliam's jaw tightened. "Who told you that?" "Your son. Benjamin came to me weeping. He said his father is lost." Eliam turned away, his hands clenching. "I am not lost. I know exactly where I am, in a world that takes everything." Jesus moved closer, his voice gentle. "And yet you still shape the clay. Why?" Eliam didn't answer. Jesus reached out and touched the collapsed jar, his fingers tracing the wet clay. A potter doesn't throw away the clay when it collapses. He reshapes it, again and again, until it becomes what it was meant to be. Eliam's throat burned. Some things can't be reshaped. Some things are too broken. Jesus met his eyes, and in that gaze, Eliam saw something that undid him. Not pity, but understanding. Is your heart too broken for God to mend? Eliam's vision blurred with tears. He sank onto a stool, his head in his hands. "I lost them. My wife, my daughter. I prayed, and God didn't answer. How can I trust Him now?" Jesus knelt beside him, his voice steady. "You prayed for their lives, and they were taken. But did you ask what God might shape from your grief?" Eliam looked up, his face wet. What could he shape from this? Jesus gestured to the workshop. You shape vessels for water, for wine, for oil, but the finest vessels are those tested by fire. Your pain has not destroyed you, Eliam. It has prepared you to hold something greater. What? Eliam whispered. Hope, Jesus said simply, for yourself, for your sons, for those who will drink from the vessels you make and remember that even broken things can be made whole. The words hung in the air, and Eliam felt something shift inside him, a crack in the hardened shell around his heart. He looked at the collapsed clay on the wheel and, for the first time in years, saw not ruin but possibility. Jesus stood, his hand resting briefly on Eliam's shoulder. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Eliam nodded, unable to speak, and Jesus left as quietly as he had come. Eliam sat alone in the workshop, the light fading to dusk, and then he reached for the clay. He began to shape it again, his hands moving with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. The jar that emerged was not perfect. Its walls were thick in places, thin in others, but it stood, whole and ready for the kiln. The next morning, Eliam rose early and lit the fire in his kiln, placing the jar inside to be tested by the flames. As he watched the fire burn, he thought of Jesus' words, "The finest vessels are tested by fire." He thought of Abigail and Naomi, of the grief that had nearly consumed him, and he whispered a prayer, not for their return, but for the strength to carry the weight of their memory and still move forward. When Joseph and Benjamin came to the workshop that afternoon, they found their father at the wheel, his hand steady, a faint smile on his lips. Benjamin hesitated at the door. "Father!" Eliam looked up, his eyes clear. "Come in, both of you. I have something to show you." He led them to the kiln and carefully drew out the jar, now hardened and gleaming. "This," he said, holding it up, "was broken yesterday, but I remade it, and it survived the fire." Joseph frowned. "It's just a jar, Father." Eliam shook his head. "No, it's more than that. It's a reminder that we can be broken and still become something beautiful." Benjamin stepped closer, his voice tentative. "Did the teacher say that?" Eliam smiled. "He did, and he reminded me that God hasn't abandoned us. He's just shaping us for something greater." Joseph's expression softened, and he placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "Then maybe it's time we let him." That evening, the three of them sat together in the courtyard, the jar filled with water at the center of their table. They spoke of Abigail and Naomi, not with the raw grief of before, but with a quiet reverence, as if their memories were treasures to be held, not wounds to be avoided. And as the stars appeared overhead, Eliam felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Word of Eliam's transformation spread through Jericho. People came to his workshop, drawn not just by his skill, but by the story of the potter who had met the teacher and been remade. Eliam began to teach others his craft, showing them how to take shapeless clay and form it into something useful, something beautiful. He spoke often of Jesus, of the man who had knelt beside him and seen not a broken man, but a vessel waiting to be filled. And when travelers passed through Jericho, asking about the teacher from Nazareth, Eliam would hand them one of his jars and say, "He is the potter, we are the clay, and if we trust him, even our brokenness can hold living water." Weeks turned into months, and the workshop became a place of quiet pilgrimage. People who had heard of Eliam's encounter with Jesus would come, some seeking pottery, others seeking something deeper, a word of hope, a story of redemption. Eliam welcomed them all, his hands never idle at the wheel, his voice steady as he shared what he had learned. One day, a woman named Rachel arrived at the workshop, her face drawn and her eyes red from weeping. She carried a bundle wrapped in cloth, and when Eliam invited her to sit, she unwrapped it to reveal the shards of a broken jar, one he had made years ago, before Abigail's death. "I bought this from you when I was newly married," she said, her voice trembling. "It held the oil for our lamps, the wine for our table. It was the first thing my husband and I owned together. But last month, he died, and in my grief, I dropped the jar. It's ruined, just like everything else." Eliam took the shards in his hands, turning them over gently. He saw the hairline fractures, the way the pieces had split along old weaknesses in the clay. It was beyond repair as a jar, but as he held them, an idea formed. "It's not ruined," he said quietly. "It's just waiting to be transformed." Over the next few days, Eliam worked on something new. He ground the shards into fine powder, mixed it with fresh clay, and shaped a new vessel, a bowl wide and shallow, perfect for holding water or bread. When he fired it in the kiln, the fragments of the old jar melded with the new clay, creating a pattern of lines and colors that told a story of brokenness and renewal. When Rachel returned, Eliam placed the bowl in her hands. She stared at it, her fingers tracing the faint lines where the old jar had been woven into the new. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Eliam nodded. "Your husband is gone, and nothing can bring him back. But his memory, like these fragments, can be part of something new. You carry him with you, Rachel, and that is not a burden, it's a gift." Rachel wept, clutching the bowl to her chest, and when she left, she carried not just the bowl, but a seed of hope that had been planted in her heart. Stories like Rachel's multiplied. A man who had lost his livelihood came, and Eliam taught him to throw pots, giving him a trade and a purpose. A child whose mother had died sat at the wheel, her small hands guided by Eliam's larger ones, and as the clay rose under her touch, she smiled for the first time in months. Benjamin, who had once been drawn to the zealot's anger, began spending more time in the workshop. He watched his father with quiet awe, seeing not weakness in his tears, but strength in his willingness to rebuild. One evening, as they closed the workshop, Benjamin said, "Father, I used to think strength was fighting, resisting, refusing to bend. But watching you, I see now that real strength is letting yourself break and trusting that something greater will put you back together." Eliam embraced his son, his heart full. "The teacher showed me that, Benjamin, and now I pray you'll let him show you too." Joseph, the elder son, was slower to soften. He carried his grief like a stone, unwilling to set it down. But one afternoon, as he worked the fields, he saw a crowd gathering on the road. Word had spread that Jesus was returning to Jericho, and Joseph, despite himself, felt compelled to go. He found his father and brother already there, standing at the edge of the crowd. Eliam's face was alight with anticipation, and when Jesus appeared, walking with his disciples, Eliam called out, "Teacher!" Jesus stopped, his eyes finding Eliam in the crowd. He smiled, a smile that seemed to warm the air around them. "Eliam, the potter, how is your vessel?" Eliam laughed, a sound of pure joy. "It stands, teacher, and it holds more than I ever thought possible." Jesus nodded. His gaze shifted to Joseph. "And this is your son?" Eliam placed a hand on Joseph's shoulder. "Yes, my eldest. Joseph has carried much." Jesus stepped closer, his eyes meeting Joseph's with a depth that made the young man's breath catch. "What do you carry, Joseph?" Joseph's jaw tightened. Anger, of grief. I don't know how to let it go." Jesus' voice was gentle. "You think if you hold on to it, you'll keep them close. But grief held too tightly becomes a stone that crushes you. Let it go, and you'll find they are closer than you ever imagined." Joseph's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since his mother's death, he let them fall. Jesus placed a hand on his shoulder, and Joseph felt something loosen inside him, a weight he had carried for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. That evening the family gathered again in the courtyard, and Joseph spoke of his mother and sister not with the bitterness that had laced his words before, but with a tenderness that surprised even himself. Benjamin listened, his own eyes glistening, and Eliam looked at his sons and saw not the boys broken by loss, but the men being shaped by grace. As the months passed, Eliam's workshop became known throughout the region. Pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem would stop in Jericho to visit the potter who had been remade by the teacher from Nazareth. Eliam would welcome them, his hands always busy at the wheel, and he would tell his story not as a tale of miracles and wonders, but as a testimony of a man who had been broken and through faith had learned to trust the potter's hands. One day, a messenger arrived with news that sent a ripple of sorrow through Jericho. Jesus had been arrested in Jerusalem, condemned by the authorities, and crucified. Eliam heard the news while shaping a jar, and his hands stilled. Benjamin, who had been sorting clay nearby, looked at his father, his face stricken. "Father, is it true?" Eliam set down his tools, his heart heavy. "If it is, then the world has lost a great light, but the light he kindled in us remains." Joseph, who had been delivering pots to a merchant, returned to find the workshop silent. He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "What now, Father? Do we go back to the way we were?" Eliam shook his head. "No, we go forward. The teacher showed us how to live, how to trust, how to be remade. His death doesn't erase that. It confirms it. He gave everything, even his life, to show us the way."
3 days later, rumors began to spread. Wild, impossible rumors. Some said Jesus had risen from the dead, that his tomb was empty, that he had been seen by his disciples and others. Eliam heard these stories from travelers, and though he could scarcely believe them, something in his spirit leapt at the possibility. "If the teacher could remake me," he said to his sons, "why couldn't God remake him?" Benjamin's eyes shone. "Do you think it's true, Father?" Eliam looked at the jars lining his workshop, each one a testament to transformation. "I think," he said slowly, "that with God nothing is impossible." Weeks later, a man named Philip, one of Jesus' followers, came to Jericho, proclaiming the resurrection and calling people to follow the way. Eliam, Joseph, and Benjamin were among the first to listen. Philip spoke of Jesus not just as a teacher, but as the Son of God, the one who had conquered death and opened the way to eternal life. That evening, Eliam was baptized in the Jordan River, his sons beside him. As the water closed over his head and he rose again, gasping and laughing, he felt as though he had been born anew, not just remade, but reborn, a vessel cleansed and ready to be filled with the Spirit of God. Eliam's workshop became more than a place of pottery. It became a gathering place for the followers of the Way, a community of broken people being made whole. Eliam taught them not just to shape clay, but to trust the potter who shaped their lives. He spoke often of the day Jesus had knelt beside him, of the words that had cracked open his heart and let the light in. And when people asked him how he had survived the loss of his wife and daughter, how he had found hope again, he would smile and say, "I learned that I am not the potter. I am the clay, and the potter's hands are good." Years passed, and Eliam grew old, his hair silver, his hands gnarled but still strong. Joseph and Benjamin took over much of the work, their own families growing around them, filling the courtyard with the laughter of grandchildren. Eliam would sit in the shade, a cup of water in his hands, water held in a jar he had made long ago, one that had survived the fire and held its contents without fail. One evening, as the sun set over Jericho, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Eliam held that jar up to the light. He thought of Abigail, of Naomi, of the grief that had once seemed insurmountable. He thought of Jesus, the man who had seen him at his lowest and had not turned away, but had knelt beside him and spoken words that reshaped his soul. "Blessed are those who mourn," Eliam whispered, "for they shall be comforted." Benjamin, now a man with a family of his own, sat beside his father. "Do you still miss them, father?" "Every day," Eliam said. "But I no longer carry the grief alone. The potter holds it with me, and he has shaped it into something I could never have imagined. A life full of purpose, a family restored, a community of hope." Joseph joined them, his own son on his lap. "What will you tell the boy about his grandmother and aunt?" Eliam smiled, his eyes crinkling. "I'll tell him they were loved, and that love, like clay, can be broken but never destroyed. It can be remade again and again into something beautiful." As the stars appeared overhead, Eliam set the jar down and closed his eyes, his heart at peace. He had been broken, yes, but in the potter's hands he had been remade. And in that remaking he had found not just survival, but life, abundant, overflowing, eternal.